Just start by saying welcome to folks. This is our October meeting of the Project Frame community, and I suppose whether this is your fifth or sixth or seventh meeting, or it's just your first, I just want to be the first one to say welcome. On deck for today, we have two great presentations. The first is from Lloyd at Systemiq, who will speak to the breakthrough effect and how the work of Systemiq is informing investment allocation from groups like Beyond Net Zero and the like. The second will be a presentation from Chloe at Zero Carbon Capital on how forward-looking emissions assessments are appearing in their own investment process. And as a reminder, this is a community meeting, so we're going to leave lots of room for Q&A with the presenters, and certainly encourage people to use the chat function liberally. So go ahead and introduce yourself now if you want to just say hello, and look forward to the dialogue in the chat function. Kelsey, do you mind jumping forward? First, I'm not Carrie. Certainly our fearless leader of Frame. Carrie's off welcoming her new baby to this world, so I'm just stepping in for today and just for this meeting. And my name's Ryan. I head climate innovation and investment at Autodesk, the large software company based in San Francisco. I've been part of the Project Frame community really since the early days, and now serve as a member of the steering committee. And in terms of housekeeping items, you may have seen, but this call will be recorded, and we're not structuring it as a webinar. So you'll be able to see one another's faces, and certainly would encourage you to stay on mute where you can. I'd also encourage you to use the chat function, like I mentioned, and do so now to be able to introduce yourself. We really have a really strong group of people as a part of this community, and the best way to get to know one another is through intros. We're also going to use the Q&A function, and this is a little bit new for us, but when the speakers are speaking, we'll run a Q&A session that both allows you to come off mute and to ask your questions, but also you'll see a Q&A feature as a part of Zoom. And so if there are questions that you're just eager to get off your chest, be sure to use that Q&A function, and the team here will go through and make sure that we address everyone. Kelsey, can you jump forward? So if you're new to Frame, Frame is a nonprofit program of Prime Coalition, and it's on a mission to be able to advance forward-looking emissions methodologies. And why that's so important is that we as investors now have the guidelines and principles and methodologies to most effectively invest our capital for climate outcomes. And Kelsey, can you continue forward? The important thing to note here is that this is a community, and this community has grown in scale quite a bit, even just this year alone. And that community is tailored to investment firms. And so one call to action for the people on this line is, if you haven't done so already, I'd encourage you to sign up and be a part of the community. You can do so through the website, which Anjali and team can share through the chat function, and also tee us up with a QR code near the end of this presentation. All to say it's free, it's quite easy, and it's just an easy way it's a way to get involved, right? First as an observing member, and then to various levels of action-oriented engagements with the working groups that are bringing the entire field forward when it comes to forward-looking emissions assessment. Okay, I've been asked to share a couple of different new items since the last community meeting, and so two big updates to share for right now. The first is that the Data and Tools Working Group has actually released several new resources that may be of value to this community. The first is a greenhouse gas impact resource dashboard. And this dashboard allows investors to be able to easily filter for GHG impact-related tools and services that exist out in the marketplace. The dashboard doesn't go as far as to rank or endorse these tools. It really is a sort of big umbrella approach to the tools and services that exist. But as an investor, you'll find these valuable in being able to just understand the landscape and to see what types of tools might be able to fit your specific investment needs. So I'd encourage you to use it, share your input with the Frame team, identify areas where it can be even better. This is sort of the first version, and certainly will grow over time. I'll also mention that the Data and Tools Working Group hosted its first tool showcase. And so on the website, you'll be able to get a general landscape overview of the strengths and weaknesses of the current landscape of tools and services writ large. I think that's just a great area for starting to understand what tools and services actually exist, and then where there might be opportunities for more tool and service offerings in the future. Kelsey, if you jump forward one. The second big update that I'll share is that the Frame team continues to gather investor points of view on the pre-investment methodology guidance that was released earlier this year. The blog that's available on the website now has a number of Q&As and deep dives into ultimately what went into that developing the methodology, and also you're able to see how practitioners and investors are applying the methodology guidance in real world investment decisions. So if you're interested in showcasing your own investment process or have input on the pre-investment methodology guidance now that it's been put to work, again, reach out to the Frame team. Anjali and Kelsey will get you started. Looking forward, if you haven't done so already, do sign up for the December 7th community meeting, which will be coming around the corner. Carrie will be back in full force, and we'll also have the team from Astenor be able to join to discuss their investment approach. Also on the horizon, the Frame team is dedicating time and resources through the end of the year to both dive into areas where forecasting, standardization, and rigor that Frame is really known for now can be used to further capital flows in adaptation and resilience. And also to take some of the methodologies that exist and make it more widely approachable and accessible. So just to double click there, the first is a closed door meeting of Frame's community of Asian investors to begin discussing the issues around capital flows and adaptation. That meeting is, I've been told, closed to registrants for now, but be on the lookout for reports and the findings at the end of the year that may be interesting to your own investment practice. The second is that with the support of the China Climate Investments, the pre-investment methodology guidance is actually being translated now into Mandarin Chinese. So look forward to seeing that at the end of the year as well, and new assets for us to be continuing to activate some of these great principles. Okay, I'll just end by saying, there are some key ways in which you can get involved and continue to deepen your relationship with the community here. The first is to email impact@primecoalition.org if you want to express your interest in an investor profile. Of course, we have Anjali and Kelsey on the line as well, who can point you in the right direction and be a friendly face. I'd also, the QR code here on the right is a great way to just sign up to Frame's mailing list and become an observer member if you're not done so already. And with that, if you have any questions on any of the above, do drop them in the chat. The team will be able to share quite a bit about what's coming around the corner. But I would like to now really get into the meat of the presentations today, really starting with Lloyd Pinnell over at Systemiq. So Lloyd, can I pass the baton your way and have you share a little bit about Systemiq's framework on the breakthrough effect?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. I'm just going to share my screen here. Bear with me one second. Everyone seeing that?
Looks great here.
Super. Thanks very much. So thanks very much for having me today. Nice to see everyone on the call. I'm Lloyd Pinnell from Systemiq. We are an advisory and investment firm focused on climate sustainability. I'm based out of London. So we try and work on systems level issues and solutions across the theme of climate change, working towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Today, I'm here to talk about our breakthrough effect report, the title page of which you can see here, which we published in January of this year. It's the third in a series, which have each been published for COP events, so the latest one, COP27. And the latest version has been conducted in partnership with the University of Exeter and the Bezos Earth Fund. The work also serves to support the Systems Change Lab initiative, which I would encourage you to have a look at the website for. It's got lots of data and tools on this topic of tipping points and climate solutions. The purpose of this work was essentially to answer two main questions. One, where could we see exponential change in climate solutions, and what conditions would be required to trigger that? And secondly, could we create a tipping cascade between sectors? Should we prioritize leaning into certain tipping points more than others to do so? I'll also try and link this back today to our to climate impact investment and how you could bring these frameworks or ways of thinking into your your methodologies and frameworks on that front, and explain a little bit about the work we do at Systemiq with Beyond Net Zero, who are a climate impact investor in across the UK and the US. So a little bit of context first in terms of tipping points. You probably know the term primarily from the climate lens. So there's increasing evidence today that we are now approaching thresholds or climate tipping points, which are essentially stages in multiple biophysical systems that risk locking us into self-perpetuating climate change. So essentially we might reach a point at which change will no longer be driven solely by our own emissions, but also irreversible processes that we have set in motion. So on one side, tipping points are a cause for alarm from a climate perspective. But we think at the same time, there are socio-economic tipping points that could affect the adoption of climate solutions that could give us cause for hope and a roadmap towards action. Of course, we're desperately off track meeting our climate targets still, with current national commitments not bringing us anywhere near 1.5 degrees. So we desperately need to accelerate our efforts. And as I hope to explain today, socioeconomic tipping points might essentially offer us a lifeline in that regard. So starting first with what is a tipping point? It's a term you may have heard before, popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, amongst others, a few years ago. Tipping points are, in the socioeconomic sense, are essentially when a new solution, that could be a technology or a practice, advances to a level where it starts to rapidly outcompete and replace the existing solutions in the market. And once you cross a tipping point, the new solution grows exponentially and forces the old one out of the market quicker than anyone could have predicted before. After a tipping point is reached, adoption can occur faster or slower, but because reinforcing feedback loops exist, it means that this growth is very hard to reverse. So essentially, it's something we should aim for to ensure that growth in climate solutions is irreversible and always accelerating up an exponential curve. So there's a lot of precedent for these in history. There are many examples of new inventions hitting tipping points and subsequently reaching full adoption incredibly quickly, especially in a pre-internet era, as you see from these examples on the right. So what you see in the first figure is historical adoption curves of a sample of infrastructure and energy systems. And in the second example, historical examples of adoption curves for a sample of manufactured goods. The left axis is the percentage of adoption in a given market, primarily the US or the UK here. And the x-axis is years over time. And I think some of these solutions demonstrate the power of tipping points. So in the US, for example, microwaves went essentially from 0% market share to 90% in less than 30 years, which is essentially the time frame we have from now until 2050. Similarly, port infrastructure for large ships in the US developed over only around a 20-year period. So you see the shape of these curves, and there's something similar in all of these technologies, which is that they can hit tipping points inherently, and once they do, it's irreversible. So we think essentially that triggering tipping points could offer us an opportunity to rapidly increase the deployment of zero-emission solutions and transform economies to be low carbon and resilient. So how do tipping points work in practice? Well, we think essentially there are three key enabling conditions that need to be in place for tipping points to happen. The first is affordability. So essentially you need your new solution, your technology or practice to reach cost parity with the incumbent technology. In our example, fossil heavy, high emission solutions. And this could be with or without different forms of policy support. So a good example here is the UK coal to gas switch, where over the last 20 years, we've seen a massive transformation of that market, mainly based on economics, mainly based on cost parity, essentially forcing that switch. The second condition that we think is less obvious is attractiveness. So often these solutions are adopted not only because of cost advantages, but also because of improved performances for non-cost reasons. So you think, for example, of household central heating replacing wood stove or other forms of heating, not just because they were cost effective, but also because they provide safer, more reliable and more convenient heat. And lastly, accessibility. So the solution to gain mass adoption needs a widespread ability to be used. So for example, with the EV charger adoption that we've seen in Norway, for example, there was a massive rollout ahead of time of public charging infrastructure. So in many instances, you actually need accessibility to be widened before the adoption curve hits the tipping point. So affordability, attractiveness, and accessibility. And in addition, tipping points can only happen if you have strong reinforcing feedback loops in place. These are the things that make the relationship between deployment and attractiveness a virtuous circle. So the more you deploy, the more attractive it is to deploy, and therefore the more you deploy, and so on. And some examples here, there are many different ones, but typically economies of scale, social contagion, complementary technologies and practices. They allow you also to overcome the forces that resist change in the initial instance, whether that's preferential policy or lobbying. And they allow for self-accelerating progress and give you the shape of that S-curve. So what's the good news so far on tipping points is that essentially across a range of low carbon solutions, we're seeing signs of tipping points coming about or already being hit. What I show here is 4 different technologies, the ones I call the 4 horsemen of the energy transition. So solar, winds, batteries, and electrolyzers. And we think solar and wind have essentially already hit their tipping point. So these charts show you on 2 axes over time the cost metric, so dollars per megawatt hour in term for solar, and on the right axis gigawatts deployed of that technology. And you see at the top there's a learning rate. In the case of solar, it's around 36%, which means for every doubling of capacity installed, costs are falling by 36%. And you see historically over the last 10 years, the cost of solar energy has fallen by 85% as installed capacity has increased 20x. And the black lines you see in these charts are the deployment we would need to reach net zero in terms of installed capacity. So looking ahead for solutions that are maybe still a bit ahead of their tipping point for battery and electrolyzers, to reach net zero, we would need 500 times more battery capacity than we have today. And if the current learning rate stays constant at around 20%, we'd expect costs to drop by a further 75%. So this relationship is really at the core of tipping points and understanding the power of technologies to scale significantly. And why is this the case? Well, technologies with sharper cost reductions as output increases tend to be those that are smallest in size and easily replicable. So there's something inherent in these technologies in that they're granular, modular, replicable, and so allow for the diffusion of technology and other companies, around the world, people to replicate those processes and drive down costs significantly. This is starting to result in serious adoption curves, as you see here. So these are just 4 charts displaying some of the exponential growth we're seeing in some key technologies: solar, wind, in this case, EV sales, and annual battery storage sales. And as you see, from 2010 to 2022, the shape of those curves are becoming increasingly exponential. And this is something we often miss. This dynamic is often missed. So the average projected annual cost reduction for solar PV between 2010 to 2020 was 2.6%. That was the projected amount of that period. So these were analysts trying to anticipate how much cost would come down, and they were expecting around 2.6%. In reality, those figures over that period were over 15%. So we often consistently underestimate the power of these technologies to drive down their costs. So what we see here is an overview of where we think market tipping points could be hit for certain key high emission sectors. And we think before 2030, we could trigger many tipping points, that the market headwinds for net zero solutions can become tailwinds, and economies that have created the conditions for these tipping points will therefore benefit. So we think we've essentially hit the tipping point ready for electricity, very close or at a tipping point for light road transport. And for certain other sectors, we think we're approaching mass market stage and not too long, some further away than others. And what are some of the benefits you get from this at a systems level, for countries that lead the way? Lower cost of energy and transport, reduced exposure to volatile fossil fuel pricing, improved energy security, often net job creation for many of these technologies, and a range of broader ancillary benefits like reduced healthcare costs. So in this report, and I won't have time to go through all the different sectors today, but we have covered all of those high emission sectors in some details, and this is an overview of the sector specific material you'll find in the report. So for example, you'll have power, building, heatings, etc. And in each case, we look at those three conditions: affordability, accessibility, attractiveness, and discuss how close we think we are to the conditions required for a tipping point and what needs to be done in order to bring those tipping points forward. And we think there is a potential for tipping points in solutions that impact 80% of global emissions in terms of sectoral coverage of the economy. The core of it is clean electrification, which I think covers around 50% of emissions. Clean hydrogen has a major role, especially across hard-to-abate industry and transport and fertilizer production. And food and land use, and as we see later, this is a more challenging sector, equally has the potential for tipping points. If I just skip to the next slide now. So you see here a kind of high-level summary across the sectors of the solutions we focus on, the current status of adoption of those solutions, the tipping point required to reach mass market stage, and our confidence in those tipping points. So this can very much differ across sectors, and the confidence we have in S-curve adoption for these new low carbon solutions are linked to the existence and strength of reinforcing feedback loops. For example, we have quite high confidence for battery electric vehicles and trucks that S-curves are possible, since battery cost declines benefit from learning and scale economies that are quite well evidenced. We have a medium level of confidence in alternative proteins reaching a tipping point because this depends inherently also on social diffusion dynamics that are not always well understood. And for certain other technologies, our confidence is lower. Heat pumps, for example, is potentially a trickier one, despite encouraging growth in the market recently, since costs and attractiveness, the convenience advantage over gas boilers can be difficult to achieve and maintain in all geographies. So this essentially leads us to two options for how to deal with triggering tipping points in the economy. You could either essentially take an option where you focus on areas where the biggest shifts are still needed to unlock tipping points. For example, here in electricity, the accessibility is a major issue, and this is about transmission and distribution of power, getting grid connections, interconnectivity. You could equally focus on the affordability of sustainable aviation fuels, power to liquid fuels in that sector. Or you could take another approach, which is to focus on early wins. So sectors that are already closest to unlocking tipping points, such as EVs, fertilizers, and potential alternative proteins. And of course, in an ideal world, you would do both, but I think there's a strong case in the short term for focusing on those early wins. Why? Because of the potential to unlock tipping cascades across other sectors, which would essentially give us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of time and returns on investment. Let me just quickly touch on tipping cascades and what they mean. So here you see an infographic essentially of the interconnections between these different sectors, cross transport, food and land use, energy, buildings, industry, and an explanation of the reinforcing feedback loops that exist. And we think there are essentially different leverage points in this system, where if you unlock a tipping point in one sector, because of the reinforcing feedback loops that link over to other sectors, you could very much drive down emissions more broadly than in that sector. And I'll give some examples shortly. But the key point is that highly emitting sectors of the economy do not exist in isolation. They're deeply interconnected, and zero emission solutions can influence transitions in multiple sectors simultaneously. So triggering a tipping point in one sector can help accelerate tipping points in other related sectors. So some of the cross-sectoral links that might exist here is a scaled rollout of heat pumps with water storage tanks would provide electrical loads with considerable low-cost flexibility, which in turn helps the integration of renewables. I know this is quite a complicated infographic and encourage you to read the report to go through it in more detail. There's an appendix where we explain all the internet connections we identify here. So this leads us to essentially identify what we think are three potential, what we call super leverage points that could trigger a cascade of tipping points across the food and energy system. So I won't spend too long on this in the interest of time, but as an example, our first super leverage point is we believe that if you can lean into rapidly accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles and reach something like 60% adoption by 2030, that could drive significantly lower cost of batteries, which could bring forward the tipping point in the power sector of solar combined with storage being cheaper than new or existing gas in large parts of the world. And equally for electric trucking, it could bring that forward significantly. So today, by 2030, we expect around 70% of installed battery capacity to be in electric vehicles. And that's a very significant cost share of solar, wind, and storage solutions combined, where battery costs account for around 30% of the total cost of power. Equally, we think in hydrogen, for several reasons, we think that using green ammonia and fertilizer is a potential super leverage point. Why? Well, fertilizer is particularly well suited to provide early scale and green hydrogen use. It has one of the lowest green premiums, only currently around 50% more than grey or fossil-based ammonia in terms of cost per ton. Ammonia can quite easily be shipped at low cost and therefore be produced with low-cost hydrogen in locations with the best renewable resources. We think the total delivery cost added to the final cost of hydrogen is only around a 10% premium. And ammonia can be used as a drop-in fuel in other sectors, in fertilizer and also in shipping, with very limited change to downstream infrastructure or industrial equipment. So essentially, green ammonia provides us with a potential unlock on the volumes that are required to drive down green hydrogen prices and bring forward tipping points in other sectors, shipping, steel, and aviation. Again, encourage you to look at some charts on the report on where we think those tipping points can happen for those other sectors. Lastly, alternative proteins. This is one where we have slightly less conviction on the power of the S-curve. But there is a very strong link between driving down the cost and improving taste, texture, and nutrition of alternative proteins, with then scaling adoption of alternative proteins and reducing pressure on land, lowering the incentive for deforestation. So with that, I'm just going to lead into what this can mean for climate investors and how to integrate tipping points and net zero solutions into climate investing. And for that, I'll use an example, our relationship, our partnership with Beyond Net Zero. As I mentioned, Beyond Net Zero is a climate impact, climate growth equity fund based in London and New York. They have 4 focus areas: decarbonisation, energy efficiency, resource conservation, and emissions management. You have here on the right a breakdown of their current portfolio and their invested capital. And Systemiq works with Beyond Net Zero essentially on their climate strategy, identifying sectors of interest, measuring measuring impact in their investments in terms of emissions reduction, but also others that I'll touch on in a moment, and working with portfolio companies to help decarbonize their operations and scale their climate solutions. So coming back to positive tipping points, I think the key takeaway is that we think these can come soon, in many cases less than 5 years away potentially, but it's very much up to us as governments, companies, and investors to trigger them, make them happen, make the enabling solutions occur. And this is not an incremental change. It would involve a fundamental system-wide change towards more efficient solutions that have inherent advantages. And once the ball gets rolling, essentially, it's very hard to put the cat back in the box. So what does this mean for investors? Well, you need to start considering, I think, where investments can be made either shortly ahead of exponentials to both help trigger them faster, but also be in a position to catch the upswing when those tipping points are unleashed. And this requires analysis that goes beyond marginal abatement cost curves, which are inherently static and often fail to account for exponential dynamics. So these marginal abatement cost curves are very useful tools, but they won't really give you an indication of the power of these relationships. And I think also recognizing that standard techno-economic modeling has in the past consistently underappreciated the pace of change, and that perhaps we need to think beyond that. It does also, of course, require changes from policymakers and companies, and that in some part requires a mindset shift to not think of climate policy necessarily as a payment for the next marginal ton of CO2 avoided, but as an investment to reach a tipping point and thereafter capture the benefits that can come from there. So in summary, I think investors should consider how and when these may emerge to seize the opportunity from enabled. An example of how you do this, I'm just providing a quick overview of the process we work with Beyond Net Zero for evaluating, assessing, measuring the impact from a climate perspective of their investments. And the name Beyond Net Zero comes essentially from the fact that they try to be net zero aligned, so setting science-based targets not only at a fund level, but also for all their portfolio companies. So ensuring that all companies measure their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and set science-based targets. And beyond net zero, also measuring the emissions reduction potential of the climate solutions they invest in and assessing the system's impact of the investments they make. So emissions reduction potential, you'll be familiar with. This is essentially a different way of saying the planned emissions reduction as per the project frame terminology, where we follow the methodology to try and calculate what a product or service is contributing in terms of avoided emissions and tracking progress against that over time. And then the system's impact is where you can loop in the tipping points analysis more closely. So what we try and do in assessing an investment is think about the broader impacts the company's products or services can have on accelerating change across the economic system, considering if the solution has a recognized role to play in the decarbonization of its sector or geography, as well as the broader economy. Thinking also about the uniqueness of the solution, whether it's commoditized or not. Considering whether the solution can catalyze climate positive change at a systems level, for example, by triggering tipping points or contributing to their acceleration, influencing consumer behavior, policy regulation or change, or technological innovation. And lastly, of course, considering risks associated with the solution from a broader ESG consideration perspective. So I think I'm out of time, so I will leave it there and go back to Ryan for Q&A.
Lloyd, really appreciate it. Thanks for walking us through the framework and how it's starting to show up a little bit with Beyond Net Zero's investment philosophy. Yeah, very fascinating to sort of take what typically is thought of as tipping points on, sort of the knock-on effects that lead to climate disaster and turn it on its head, right? And think about where markets are evolving and tipping points that can help that happen. For folks on the call here, like I mentioned before, we'll use the Q&A function if you want to just put your questions down. We have a couple already in queue, but I also welcome you to raise your hand. And so feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you to give you some floor space to ask Lloyd some follow-up questions. While you're thinking of those, maybe Lloyd, I'll kickstart one just to get the juices flowing. I was sort of looking through, and you mentioned this, you alluded to it a little bit, but there are some places where maybe these tipping points might be challenged or the pathways aren't super clear yet. And I saw land use as one that perhaps was colored in red in a couple of places. I'm curious how you think about those areas relative to whether or not investment in private sector capital is like a place to be putting resources to work when it comes to these climate outcomes we want to drive, or does that mean that I should infer that this is much more of a place for political or public policy intervention in the long run? Like, how do you think about it from like an investment lens?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think the framework sort of helps with that in understanding what the blockers are. And in some cases, the big issues in getting the enabling conditions in place will be policy related. In other cases, it might be actually company behavior. And in other cases, it really is about just getting a larger scale of capital deployed. And I think land use is a good example where actually some of those more fundamental policy levers are quite important, and it's unlikely that we see a real tipping point without them unlocking change. But that's not to say there isn't a role for private investment in those sectors. It's still massively important, and especially in getting the general conditions for policymakers to be able to take those decisions. We have a table in the report that I recommend going through that essentially identifies key actions across investors, consumers, and policymakers to enable tipping points across different sectors. We feel, unfortunately, that in land use, the tipping point is quite far away, and we're not fully convinced of the power of the reinforcing feedback loops in that sector. So there are sectors that won't necessarily take exponential change, right? They might simply be a linear process that requires a lot of work. But there's still a role for private capital in those sectors. It just takes a different form. It might be more long-term. And those linear changes are just as important. Of course, they'll be less rapid, but if there is no exponential solution, getting the linear one as quick as you can essentially is the next best alternative.
Thanks, Lloyd. Helpful. Vivek, I see your hand.
Yeah, okay, no, thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Lloyd. Actually, I was going to make a comment, but maybe it's a question. So I have two questions. The first question is, LEDs have had a big impact on energy reduction in the past decade, and I saw that missing in your analysis because I think the adoption was really fast and the energy impact was significant. So maybe it's worth considering that, or maybe a question: why did you not consider that? And the second question is, I saw green hydrogen you have high confidence, and heat pumps you have low confidence. So if you could explain the two, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So on your first question, unfortunately, we tried to limit our analysis to essentially one key solution by major sector. This can be extended to a whole range of different technologies, including LEDs, right? And they're very much the solution I think has seen a tipping point already. I think another thing that we don't cover in great detail, but would be really interesting to explore further, is energy efficiency.
And LEDs are part of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's something we would have liked to have gone deeper into, but unfortunately didn't cover in this report. And on your second question, it's a good push, and I think it's related to our confidence in the existence of these reinforcing feedback loops. So it's actually quite hard to get good data on historical cost declines for heat pumps. They have been around for a long time, but long data series are actually quite hard to come by. We have seen some quite encouraging developments in the market over the last year that maybe indicate that we were a bit too pessimistic on our assessment. So in the US, I know, for example, this year, whilst generally sales of home heating and cooling solutions have come down, heat pumps have also dropped in volume terms overall, but have taken over a greater market share. So slightly shrinking market, but heat pumps taking a larger share of that market, which is encouraging. But we struggled in the data to find a real convincing story between scale and cost declines for that sector. And maybe it's something that just hasn't been demonstrated yet. It might very much be there, because in its essence, it is still a modular, replicable technology that could, in theory, have strong learning curves.
Yeah, no, because it's like the AC market, right? I mean, it's just the inverse of the AC market. And if you looked at the AC market, it's scaled up. So the cost reduction, if you could somehow look at the cost reduction over the AC systems, maybe there's something there. But yeah.
Yeah, so yeah. I think we also very much focused on areas that consume the most, the most energy for home heating, which is normally northern latitudes.
Yes.
I think that we have probably seen much more aggressive adoption curves in like the south of the US and other geographies, but in places like Canada, the UK, the cost premium tends to be quite large, and there's quite a big role for policy to bridge that gap. Some regions, France, Italy, have had very aggressive policies on heat pumps, and it's worked very well. In the UK, where I'm based, it's been much slower, unfortunately.
Okay. And sorry, and the last question was about green hydrogen? Why do you have such high confidence?
Yeah, I think with green hydrogen, you know, the big elements of the cost stack in green hydrogen, when you think about how it's produced, are largely the solar and wind, the transmission and the transportation. I think across those dimensions, we see real potential for cost curves, and it's a very encouraging series of projects that have been announced or have started being built. I encourage you also to look at the Make a Mission Possible project tracker, which essentially tracks all the major projects for hard to abate sectors around the world. I'm happy to provide a link to that after. And there we're just seeing a lot of traction in the market, I think, of people.
And the electrolyzers, because one would have thought the electrolyzers.
Yes, of course, and electrolyzers, of course. Sorry, which as you saw in my earlier charts, is a technology that we think can display these features of rapid.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for taking so much time.
There are no sorries there, Vivek. I appreciate you asking questions and diving deep here. And thanks there, Lloyd. Rick Cutright, I see a question from you in the Q&A. Do you mind if I invite you to come off mute and chime in?
Sure. Yeah. So I had asked back when you were sort of showing some of the data, I had asked about what can we learn about tipping points when we look at something like solar, where it's being deployed, you know, at the utility scale, the commercial scale, and the residential. Can we learn something there from sort of the learning curve dynamics, and how does that contrast with wind, which a lot of its lower cost and penetration is more from economies of scale perspective?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I guess we've seen over the last year or two or so, you know, wind costs taking back up. So I think what I would say is the first thing we learned from wind is that the process can be quite complicated. So the story of how solar got cheap is quite fascinating. You know, it started in the US, then it moved to Germany, which kind of took the mantle, then Japan, and then China. And in different regions, different policies or you know, environments came about that allowed for the rapid cost declines of solar. So I think what we can learn from it is that it won't necessarily happen in the way we think it will, and sometimes it will pass from country to country. But if the features of that technology are there, it can happen nonetheless. And I think the other thing we can learn from it is that the potential use cases for the technologies will evolve over time, right? So no one really imagined, I think, at the outset that solar would have the range of applications that it does today. So that's kind of linked to our, you know, our super leverage points, and the fact that once technologies get to a certain level in terms of adoption and cost, the things you can do with them really expand. But I think the comparison with wind is an interesting one in that it may well be that there is something inherent in solar that allows it to have a more aggressive cost curve than wind. We have been looking into what's happening with wind costs over the last year, though, and our strong sense is that a lot of these sort of shorter term price increases are temporary, and that the fundamental dynamics that exist, it's about a series of factors converging, you know, short term aggressive price inflation and certain component costs. But we think ultimately they'll be resolved, and the cost curve will over the next few years, you know, refind its downwards route. Though possibly not as aggressive as solar, which has seen a really incredible learning rate.
Just a quick follow-on question while I've got the mic. What about the impact of reliability? Like, an interesting thing I saw in solar was the trend used to be larger and larger higher voltage inverters, but now even very large gigawatt scale solar projects will use much smaller inverters. So because instead of having to go and do repairs or whatever, or having a big section of the array down, they can just quickly sort of replace it with the same kind of units you would find, you know, at commercial and residential. So is reliability and modularity connected, and sort of how that drives tipping points in these different sectors?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it would probably fit nicely in the bucket of accessibility or affordability, accessibility, and I forget my last word now. But essentially, I think it's something to do with the attractiveness. So it's something to do with the attractiveness. So I think as these technologies go through these processes, they don't only go down cost curves, they also become more attractive. They offer other features like reliability that that enable the tipping point to happen. Sometimes cost isn't enough and the rest needs to follow. And I think that's a good example of it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sir Rick. Thanks, Lloyd. Yeah, I think this is a fascinating framework. I mean, it's interesting from like a venture standpoint to understand what enabling conditions ultimately get the flywheel moving towards these tipping points. And you know, Anjali, I'm sort of channeling a little bit of your comment around catalytic capital and where, you know, different forms of capital need to play to help steer these tipping points to being realized. And, you know, each of us has our own risk and reward profiles as we're thinking about you know, the allocation of resources and capital and where that fits along that systemic framework. I think is quite fascinating. So yeah, please join me as everyone here in sort of like a silent celebration of Lloyd and sharing the research, and yeah, would encourage folks to go and dive deeper into the report and reach out directly. All right, so we're gonna just pivot into the second presentation for today. This is coming from Chloe at Zero Carbon Capital to dive deep into their forward-looking assessment methodology that's used within the investment firm. And Chloe, can I pass the baton your way?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Brian, and thanks, Lloyd. That was super interesting. I'm going to share my screen. How does that look? Can you see that? Can you see my screen?
Looks great there, Chloe.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Chloe. I'm from Zero Carbon Capital. We are a London-based VC fund, and we invest exclusively in climate technologies. So today I'm going to be sharing sort of our investment methodology and how impact is incorporated into that. I'll give an overview, share some of our goals and our methodology, and a couple of case studies at the end to see how we put it into practice. So to start with, we're a London-based VC fund, and we focus on decarbonisation, specifically in the carbon, in the climate space. So we aim to fund startups that are solving the biggest challenges of decarbonisation. Our focus is on pre-seed and seed stage. So we like to invest very early, and we're vertical agnostic, but 100% climate focused. So we invest across all the typical kind of climate verticals, so energy, food and ag, industry, built environment, etc. And every investment is covered by the impact assessments I'm showing today. We invest across Europe as well as Israel. Our first fund was UK focused, and we're now investing out of our second fund, which has a broader geographical mandate. And we've made 9 investments to date out of that second fund since April of last year, so April 2022. And we're currently 4 team members, and we all participate in impact assessments, but I'm kind of responsible for them. I'm the research and analysis lead, so I do all of our sort of thematic research and also impact research. So our impact goals, so we target companies with a technology that could have an emissions reduction potential of 0.5 gigatons per year in 2050. And, you know, as Lloyd pointed out, you know, we've made excellent progress in certain areas. You know, we're reaching these tipping points in solar deployment and EV deployment and many of these sectors. But despite this, and despite many emerging technologies in some of the other areas, we're not yet on track to reach net zero in 2050. So areas like cement, steel manufacture, food production, industrial heat, these are still problems that are largely unsolved. And so we need to discover, optimize, and commercialize fundamentally new science to address these challenges. And so that's why we focus on early stage, so we prefer pre-seed, in deep science and tech. So we focus on scientific innovation, so specifically, you know, atoms and molecules. We don't invest in things that are purely software, because we think this is where we as very early stage investors can have the biggest impact. Again, you know, as came up in the chat, there are various barriers. Despite, you know, everyone acknowledging that we need to decarbonize, there are some barriers that are kind of outside of the control of investors. So things like private interests, you know, there are massive corporations with vested interests that can sometimes pervert government decisions, or, lack of risk taking from some large incumbents, and in some cases ineffective policies. So whilst things like the IRA have been successful in driving a lot of investment into manufacturing and many other things, there are some areas where policy would have a bigger role to play and could be used more successfully. And the big barrier, and the one that we think we can solve with investment, is the green premium, so the relatively lower cost of fossil fuel-based technologies and products. And so by providing capital to scale these alternative technologies and to bring down the green premium, we believe, if the decarbonized option is also the cheapest and the fastest and the highest quality, then it makes it much harder to block, or, for these other barriers to block it. So our impact assessment methodology. So as I mentioned, we look for an emissions reduction potential of 0.5 gigaton per year in 2050. So we use what Project Frame defines as potential impact rather than planned impact. So we look at the whole market for avoidable emissions so that we can identify the critical activities that require decarbonisation. So within that, we invest in both direct and facilitating technologies. So a direct technology where deployment of that technology has a kind of measurable unit impact versus an incumbent technology. And then facilitating enabling technologies is one where it won't necessarily have a unit impact, but is critical for the decarbonisation of a particular activity. So where the counterfactual scenario where the technology isn't deployed results in limited or no emissions reduction. And to account for these, where it's harder to use a per unit impact, we identify the key barriers to adoption of a solution that this is enabling, that's beyond cost. So for example, fast charging, unlocking adoption for electric vehicles by relieving range anxiety, or novel grid technologies facilitating greater renewables penetration. And for each of these, whether it's direct or facilitating, we develop a robust theory of change, so as to how this technology will lead to emissions reduction. And we take into consideration what the baseline will be in 2050. So what changes we think will have been adopted by then. This is obviously a subjective exercise, but it's really important to us to try and imagine what the baseline will be and how this technology will lead to an impact. And for both of them, we assess the technology as having the potential to beat other incumbent or emerging technologies in terms of cost and other metrics like energy demand, for example, that would allow them to capture a significant portion of the emissions reduction potential. And we try and apply the principles, again, outlined by Project Frame. So transparency, where we state our assumptions and data sources. Robustness, we try and go back to first principles. And conservatism, we don't want to overestimate the potential impact. But at the same time, we don't want to miss investing in an opportunity that could have a big impact. And finally, so decarbonisation is our main metric that we aim to track and account for, but we do screen for other adverse impacts using the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And just to share why we use potential impact rather than planned impact, why aren't we attributing what we think the impact of a particular company could be? And really that's a function of the way we invest. So because we make early stage investments, we think it will take quite some time for these companies to scale. And often we're investing in, 2 scientist entrepreneurs in a lab that may not have a business model yet. So we don't want to, again, with the principles in mind, we don't want to over specify what and apply an arbitrary number to their planned impact. And how does this fit into our investment process? So it comes in, even before we see opportunities. So we look for research areas, and many of them are kind of very similar to those that Lloyd shared in his presentation. And we use the emissions reduction potential and this barrier of 0.5 gigaton in our triage. So we want to make sure that we're not taking companies through due diligence unless they meet that threshold for decarbonisation. But it's really something that we do revisit throughout the process, and we constantly scrutinise and have discussions as a team to make sure our theory of change is robust. And if all goes to plan, then we make an investment and they join our portfolio. So what does our governance process look like? So we like to take a board seat if we're a lead investor, or if our other co-investors are generalist investors that maybe don't have a focus on climate, we will also ask for a board seat so that we can be the voice for climate impact. And again, that carries through to introductions to later stage investors who share our vision, so that the impact can be maintained with, maintaining investors who are aligned with our vision. But really, in most cases for our companies, the climate impact and financial success are inextricably linked. So if they are financially successful, they will have an impact through deployment of their technologies. One thing to note is we don't yet track the realized impact of our portfolio companies, again, largely because they're quite early and we're in our second fund, but being part of the project frame community is really useful in that regard, so that as we grow, we can really implement best practices as to how we track the avoided emissions of our companies. But we are looking to do annual reviews to evaluate how they're performing and to kind of grade success and how they're progressing towards the emissions reduction potential that we've defined for them, evaluating whether the market has changed, whether there are new competitors, new policy, and how well the company are executing on achieving their impact. So I'd like to share a couple of case studies now. So one for a direct impact technology that we invested in, and another for a facilitating technology. I'm not sharing the spreadsheets here, but I think they should be linked in the investor profile that's on the Project Frame website. So if you want to interrogate our calculations, please go ahead. The spreadsheet should be there. So ammonia again. So ammonia is a very important industrial chemical that's mostly used as a fertilizer. And currently its production relies on the Haber-Bosch process. So it combines nitrogen and hydrogen, which is typically produced from fossil fuels, either through steam methane reforming or coal gasification, and is very emissions intensive. So on average, each ton of ammonia that's produced releases 2.9 tons of CO2. And given the demand for ammonia as a fertilizer, this leads to very large current emissions from its production. And demand is actually set to increase for ammonia. So not only is it used as a fertilizer, but it's also proposed as a fuel for kind of hard to abate long distance transport, like shipping, for example. And so there are many different projections about how demand will grow. The IEA suggests it will more than double to about 450 megatons. IRENA, I think, suggests it will be 700 megatons. So there's a range of projections, but they kind of all agree that emissions will increase. This is what a theory of change looks like, and we develop a theory of change for all our investments. So before I talk about the particular investment, which is NitroFix, just to walk through how this works. So we examine how the activities of a particular startup will lead to particular outcomes and lead to emissions reduction that reaches our bar of 0.5 gigaton per year by 2050. And so in this case, we're talking about NitroFix. We invested in NitroFix at the start of this year, and they are an early stage startup with an electrochemical technology that takes nitrogen from the air and hydrogen, water as a hydrogen source rather than methane or fossil fuels, And they have a relatively low energy and low temperature electrochemical process using a novel catalyst technology that means you can drastically reduce emissions. And we think that that the main source of emissions in this case will come from the emissions of energy production to power the electrochemical process. So what do the calculations look like? So as we mentioned previously, the emissions today are already 0.5 gigaton. And by using the best available technology, so the best available steam methane reforming that we have, that's very efficient, you can actually make quite a big dent on the emissions. And if we use that as our baseline in 2050, so given the increase in demand, I think we're using IEA numbers here for the demand projections. If we then calculate the energy demand for the electrochemical process and the energy generation emissions from the power to power that process, and just a note on that, we use the emissions intensity of the Swedish grid. So as a proxy, it's already possible to have a grid that clean, and we believe that most grids will be much cleaner in 2050. So we use the emissions intensity of the Swedish grid, and if we use that, then we can see it has an emissions reduction potential of 0.5 gigaton by 2050. So we know that that's a direct impact because deployment of the solution will lead to a direct emissions reduction relative to ammonia production today. And the second example I want to give is of a technology that enables fast charging electric vehicles, which we believe will reduce emissions by accelerating EV adoption by reducing range anxiety. And so, as we know, transport and particularly passenger vehicles are currently one of the biggest sources of emissions. So they're responsible for about 3 gigatons of CO2 per year. And we also know that EV adoption is an area where we are making excellent progress. And particularly for passenger vehicles, larger vehicles, less so. But we already expect emissions to reduce dramatically over the 21st century. And the two key barriers that remain are cost, although this is coming down. And the second one is range anxiety. And there are numerous surveys that suggest that range anxiety, so the perception that you can't travel as far in an EV and it would take too long to charge, is stopping people who could afford it from buying EVs. And so again, we've developed a theory of change here for a company we invested in its previous round. So this is Ekion Technologies, and they're developing niobium oxide anodes for use in lithium-ion batteries. So these niobium oxide anodes enable fast charging. So it means you can charge a car in a matter of minutes rather than tens of minutes. And we expect that this would accelerate adoption not only among EV drivers, but perhaps even make it more viable for larger vehicles to use batteries as a result of faster charging. And so what do our estimates look like in this case? So if you look at the blue line, this is the baseline reduction in emissions from the adoption of EVs rather than internal combustion engine vehicles. And we've applied an assumption, and this is something that you can tweak in the calculations to see if your assumptions are reasonable. So we've assumed that we can accelerate adoption of EVs by 20% by introducing this fast charging technology. And if this is the case, then we can see how we expect emissions to reduce in the red case, and that leads to an emissions reduction potential of 0.6 gigatons of CO2 in 2050. And finally, just a note, this is my last slide, just a note on lessons learned. So actually, I wanted to say that doing this investor profile has been a very useful process for me, because we haven't changed necessarily how we conduct impact assessments internally, but we have worked to align our internal vocabulary around impact to align it more closely with that of Project Frame. And I think that's really important because the more we have standardization in this space, the more people we can an investment we can bring to this space and the bigger impact we can have. So I would encourage anyone to really have a go and complete an investor profile and see what it makes you think about, because it was a really good process for us. And thank you for listening, and I hope you have some questions.
Okay, thank you there, Chloe. I really appreciate it. Yeah, maybe another sort of virtual round of applause here for Chloe. It's one thing to be having the rubber hit the road in capital allocation with some of the methodologies, and it's another to show it. And so I just appreciate the transparency and the open dialogue here. It's super helpful. Maybe get things started. Jessica, I see in the Q&A that you've teed up a question. Do you mind if I pass the baton your way to come off mute and share?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks so much for that, Chloe. I love these meetings and diving deep. I don't come from an investment background. Alberta EcoTrust is a charity, so policy, advocacy, and change always figures heavily in our work. But I'm curious, because you identified it specifically as a barrier, how do you just recognize that as a barrier and kind of work around it, or do you guys ever try to actually address it or change it or advocate?
Yeah, it's actually currently we don't do much advocacy, so we're quite a small team. There's 4 of us and we're quite busy, but it is something that we talk about a lot. How could we get involved more in advocacy? And ideally, if we had a bit more time, then we would do it more actively, but we do see it as something that's really important and we would like to do more of, but we probably don't do enough of at the moment, if we're honest.
Really. Yeah, just encourage folks to raise a hand if you have additional questions for Chloe and what they're doing with zero carbon capital. Rick.
Thank you, Chloe. Great example. As we just talked at the content working group yesterday about grid intensity and those types of things, I thought your ammonia example was sort of spot on, because it highlights, I think, where the assumptions can drive very different behavior. So by using the 28, I think it was, number from Sweden, which makes a lot of sense, sound logic, and why you would do that, you get to a different outcome than if someone used like the IEA 2050 number, which is 10 times higher, which would say that the emissions are actually higher from this solution than from the incumbent technologies. Or if someone like us was more focused on planned, you wouldn't even imagine a scenario that low, so you would never invest in this. So I just find it generally interesting how we're all kind of using frame. We're all following the same methodology, and yet we can get to very different conclusions in terms of what is a good impact and where do we want to put our money.
Yeah, you raise a really important point. I think like green hydrogen or what people refer to as green hydrogen is really actually often not that green. Like you really need a very clean grid to have an impact in these areas, and it's something that we're really conscious of, and we're kind of not at the stage of deploying these things, but when people are, I think it's a massive consideration to make sure that there's dedicated renewables to power these things. Otherwise, it can make the problem worse.
I find it quite enlightening to be able to even ask that question, right? We wouldn't even be able to have the insights on what those underpinning assumptions were on the outcomes we wanted to drive without some alignment around the principles and guidelines and methodologies that enumerate those assumptions. And so even to know that is something that is a part of the discount rate you give to this, and is a key assumption for driving the impact success of the firm and that specific investment, is powerful in itself, right? Because then you can work with the Jessicas and others of the world who are sort of leaning in at other levers for how to be able to ensure that the outcomes we get to ultimately get realized. So I find that fascinating. Got a question in the chat from Louisa. Are you comfortable coming off of mute to share? I will put a pin in it for now, or maybe pass the baton to Anjali. Would you care to share on Louisa's behalf?
I think Louisa shares, I think she might have lost her voice, so I'll just read her question out loud. Thank you for the great presentation. I would be interested to know how you arrived at the specific emission reduction potential threshold of 0.5 gigatons CO2 a year. The reason I ask this is because there's so much focus and scrutiny about impact targets these days. I love this question. I often think about this question. We actually even think about prime strategy.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The threshold predates me joining Zero Carbon Capital, so I think I'll give the best answer I can. I think it's a high threshold, right? And because we look for potential impact, we're not always saying that a particular fund will make that impact, but we're saying if they scale and take a significant chunk of that big market, they will have a big impact. So we're using it to identify big problem areas to tackle, rather than using the planned impact to say that we will reach that threshold specifically. Yeah, I guess there are other approaches, but I guess 0.5 gigatons is about 1% of emissions roughly. So it's a big target, I think, is the main aim.
Anjali, was there anything you wanted to add?
I'll just share that actually there is some debate in the frame community about the use of targets, and there are some folks who have completed investor profiles who have said the targets are arbitrary. And so what is underneath the targets and how can we actually get further into unpacking the goals without necessarily assuming that setting a number that basically lets you set and forget and not really think about your strategy and the system impacts could be worth developing methodologically.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Mark, I see your hand up.
Chloe, question. As you also presented, solar is the biggest enabler. How do you factor then in not only direct, but in particular the indirect impact? To give you an example, I believe that direct air capture is going to be enabled by solar power because it will continue to consume quite a bit of power. And unless you have really dirt cheap power, it's never gonna fly. So how do you bring that all together in a consistent framework?
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, there are many people who've done more in-depth studies than I have, but about sort of where to prioritize limited resources, right? If we only have a limited amount of solar power, displacing coal generation is going to be much more effective than using that power for carbon dioxide removal, for example. So yeah, it's something we bear in mind, and we have, lots very in-depth conversations about this in our investment meetings, and we do take it into consideration. How it's structured explicitly in our methodology, I don't know if it is, but it's certainly something that's very important and something that we think about.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Ryan. Can I invite you to come off mute?
Great, thanks a lot, guys. Chloe, great presentation. I wanted to ask about how you do, I suppose, assessments of your assumptions, because I know we talked earlier about, setting the targets, and the targets could be arbitrary, and of course, there are a lot of assumptions that go into these models, right? And something that, like I mentioned in the chat, when you were doing the creating models like these at Project Drawdown, we also had a lot of assumptions going into this work. And we realized that the output was very sensitive in some cases to these assumptions. And for instance, I noticed that you said in your battery example that you assumed that there would be a 20% reduction as a result of this particular technology. And of course, if that was a different assumption, the results could be quite different. Mm-hmm. So how do you assess, validate, internally qualify your assumptions as you go through these? And would you, or can you give an example of when these kind of analyses have invalidated an investment for your team, where you said, well, we've tried the best we can with these models, and we just cannot see how this can meet the threshold of 0.5 gigatons?
Yeah, okay. So I'll park the second question for now, but first of all, totally agree with you that it's super sensitive to these assumptions, and I think that will ring true for everyone on this call who does impact assessments, especially for us, because we're projecting out to 2050 and we want to have an impact by 2050, which is kind of has its pros and cons to try and do it that way, but it means that we don't necessarily know what the baseline is. And I think our philosophy is sometimes it's hard to prove those, but we try and get as many data sources as possible. And I think just try and be transparent and about our assumptions. And obviously there are a lot of assumptions that go into it, but because we're making these big projections, we actually try and have the minimum number of assumptions and parameters in there as possible so that it's really easily scrutinizable, and try and use the most robust data sources we can find, basically. And sometimes we don't know, there is a value judgment to try and project out to 2050, but we just want to be, the main aim is to try and allocate capital to important projects that we think will have a big impact. And so in the absence of being able to find a really accurate number, we just want to be confident that we can stand up and say, this is why we've invested in it. You can scrutinize our assumptions, and do you agree with us, and have a conversation about it and see, and then use that to invest the best we can. But you're right, it's subjective. A situation where these assumptions haven't allowed us to reach the threshold. I think the most obvious one where we see this is in cases where they're using companies are using waste feedstocks or low cost feedstocks. They're waste, so we'll be able to use it at low cost. And often when we do the calculations, maybe if they were to deploy enough of it, then it would reach 0.5 gigaton, but maybe there's not enough of that waste feedstock for them to ever for that emissions reduction potential ever to be achieved. So I think that's probably the most common case that we see where it doesn't meet our threshold.
Thanks, Kelly.
Great, thanks.
Also great to sort of see the feedback cycles, right? I think I caught that in some of your process where, this is a part of pre-investment, which is a big part of this conversation, of course, but also into some of the management of that investment decision. And I imagine that there's some revisiting of assumptions over time that can inform, how you might view a company.
Yeah, and we get more information during DD, how technology works, what other competitors or incumbents might be that allow us to refine our theory of change and revisit them.
Thank you. David, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. With Ambient Carbon, we're eradicating low concentration methane from point sources. We're based in Copenhagen. I'm curious because I'm very fascinated by your way of operating and your way of viewing things. For instance, with the potential impact. So I'm curious with your portfolio companies, when you're getting additional investments, let's say the seed round, the climate tech VCs that are looking to this, are they using a kind of a similar approach as yours, or are they looking at a kind of a more traditional approach? For instance, not necessarily using the potential impact as a criteria.
Yeah, I think certainly later stage investors, as I understand it, are more likely to use planned impact because as a company grows, they're more likely to have a good idea of what, and have more of a business plan about volumes and what their trajectory is going to look like. So based on, and different companies have different different thresholds or different targets, some of which aren't decarbonization focused, but are more have more of a social impact focus, or water usage, or other circularity. So every fund is different and has different thresholds and different ways of measuring it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Vivek, back to you.
Okay, so thanks, Chloe. Great presentation. We're also at Prithvi. We're also an early stage fund. We do deep science projects, and We are also getting involved with potential impact. So just want to understand from your perspective, when you model out, because it's the tail that really makes all these numbers, right? It's the early stage doesn't matter. It's the tail of the S curve that really matters. So how are you looking at those markets developing? Because are you factoring in because it's not a particular company, right? You're assuming that this technology percolates into society and everyone else is using it, right? It's not that they're going to get a certain market share. This has to be wide. Do you have like a technology S-curve assumption in there, or could you just provide some more insight as to how you work, say, the last decade of the analysis?
Yeah, so our assumption, we don't always include an S-curve. So I know that some other companies, I think maybe in the last meeting, maybe it was CEV presented their threshold doesn't involve, a single measurement in 2050, but involves integrating under the curve, which, I'm not saying either is better than the other, but it's a different way of accounting for emissions. And by not doing the area under the curve, we don't have to use S-curves. And so I think 2050 is kind of, what's the best way of putting it? It's kind of far enough away that we hope it has scaled by then and that it has reached, the top of the S-curve.
So I'm sorry. So you do not use it. You do not integrate under the curve.
No.
And okay. So
we assume that if we're investing now, we know these early stage technologies take time to scale, but implicit in our assumption is that it has scaled by then. But we don't use S-curves. We could do, and we do in some cases, but we don't in every case.
Okay, thank you.
Rick, I'll pass it your way, and then we'll wrap up quickly after that.
Just a follow-on question to that. I totally get not using the S-curve because Lloyd just showed us that they should all be there by 2050 anyway. But do you narrow the scope? Like, do you think about really the entire TAM, or do you try to focus on a particular SAM or even a SOM in terms of the magnitude of how much diffusion you're going to get from that solution?
We use a TAM, and we don't assume that one company will take the whole TAM. We use the TAM coupled with a high bar. So the way we think about it is if a company can have the best technology and take a significant chunk of that TAM, a significant chunk of 0.5 gigaton is a big chunk. So we use the TAM and a big target so that the impact is big either way if it's successful, is how we think about it.
Got it. Thanks.
Thanks there, Chloe. Hey, with that, I think we'll look to wrap up this session of our community meeting. I mentioned on the outset, I've been a part of the Project Frame community now for a couple of years and serve as a part of the steering committee. And I'm just constantly floored with the quality of people that are around the table. Just truly remarkable mission-driven people who are deploying and influencing capital towards these climate outcomes. And so I appreciate, Chloe, you sharing much about how you're allocating capital, and then Lloyd, how you are sort of setting the frameworks that are, influencing the entire system. So, once again, thank you both for sharing your time. A round of applause from everyone on the line here for folks taking time out of their busy days to join us. Just as a reminder, the next community meeting will be in December. So if you haven't signed up yet, please do so. Carrie will be back, in her leadership role to take the community forward. And if you have any questions for Team Frame, Anjali and Kelsey will be around after this meeting. Feel free to stay on and introduce yourself and look to get involved with the folks. And lastly, I'll just say that all of our time is really valuable, right? And you can be spending your time doing pretty much anything, and you chose it to be part of this community and pushing this entire field forward. And so my hat's off to you. Much appreciate everyone joining. Thank you all.